So thanks everybody for coming. This was a last minute edition, so I'm glad that you found out about it and wanted to come join us. Our talk today is going to be how to turn data into money. A lot of companies that you might have talked to have got this sort of innate sense that they have a lot of data and that data has some value somehow. But it's sort of a blank canvas as to how you get from I've got a lot of data to here's actual attributable revenue that I'm bringing in from that data. So that's what we're going to focus on today. My ideal goal is that every single one of you here will have the ability to come away with something that you can bring to your company about the data that you're already using and bring them money and reap that benefit for yourself. There's nothing that stands out more than somebody who's dealing with the data day to day than to bring up and speak at the level and speak to the priorities and speak to the interest of those senior executives who are dealing with these things. So I'm going to try to help bring us up to that level and put you on a playing field with people that deal with this data. Kind of three broad categories we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what gives data value from an economic sense. And I'm going to say very high level, so I'm not going to get super deep into supply and demand analysis or anything. I just want to give you a sense for like what actually creates the economic value behind data that you have. What do you look for? What types of things are valuable? And who typically finds that information valuable? The second one is for anybody who touches data, which everybody touch data in some way in their job. It's sort of a trick question at this point. Everybody who touches it has some role to play in making that data better or potentially not making it worse, which is usually the way it goes. So we're going to give you some things to kind of think about there, to keep in mind. And then the last part, again, that's why we're here. We're going to look at some examples about how you take that data in whatever form it's in and try to use it, and some tactical stuff that you can do to actually put yourself in a position where your company can generate revenue directly from that data in one way or another. And then if there's any time left over, I'm just going to sit back and let you guys ask me questions, and if any of you have data that you're thinking about or you just want to sort of kick around some ideas about how to make money from that, this is a great venue for doing that because the tools that we use are typically common across a lot of different types of businesses. So an important thing to realize that when we're talking about data today, there's really two types of data scientists and data science. So we got 52. There's technical data science, which is anybody here who has the title data scientist. This is typically what your title is. These are people who are focused primarily on optimization. They're focused on product development. You typically have discrete tasks, projects that you're asked to do, and your job is to figure out how to do them in the way that makes the result as accurate as possible. That's a technical data science approach to this. Things like statisticians, data engineers, the people with computer science backgrounds, the technical side of things. On the other side is the business side of things, which you still need the technical stuff to make the business side work, but it's just concerned with different things. The scope is much broader. You're looking anywhere in a business. You're not looking at specific problems. You're looking at the business as a whole and looking for those problems. You're focused on revenue, typically higher level positions. At this point, the chief data officer is about as high as you can get. Something like 15% of companies have a named chief data officer at this point. It's just focused on data. And they typically, people on this side are from the business backgrounds, more of a management consulting, analysis, product development, generally people who wear sport coats and not people who wear hoodies. This room should be a mix of those two. I'm going to take anybody that's on the technical side and I'm going to focus on what it means to be on this side and how to think like this side, because the decisions you make here and in the development side are going to inform whether people like me over here have anything to do, because we need the data to do it. I can do that because I'm here. You can see my sport coat. My background is from purely business side until I moved in just recently, the last couple of years, when being a data scientist was a thing you could set out to do. My goal in my career has always been to come from the business side, but I also heavily integrate the technical side to that, and the nexus of the two is really where I'm the strongest, and that is where data science at this point on the business side is really starting to focus. And so I'm really excited about the next couple of years being able to leverage that. I also do a lot in entrepreneurship, Startup Jacks, if anybody's interested in that, help manage that. I find that the entrepreneurial mindset can go a long way in this kind of business, because you're always constantly having to think about what's the next thing you can do, what's the next money maker you're going to make. And I recommend anybody who's dealing with this to know at least Python and R. Again, Python is if you're building stuff, R is if you're trying to understand it. It's important to know, important to have that technical mindset. Why data has value? These are the Labambo bones. They were found in South Africa about 45,000 years ago. This is the first instance of recorded data in the archaeological record. These are tally sticks. They were used to record quantities, typically in the context of like a receipt, or whatever the version of a receipt would have been 45,000 years ago. The reason I'm showing you this is not to impress you with my archaeological prowess. It's to show you that if your primary use of data right now is to count it and then show other people those numbers, you haven't come that far from scratching tick marks on bonobo bones, have you? Right? This is how data started. Where we are now is about getting past that. What really gave us the ability to start to do that was when hard disks and platters and things got to the point where you could hold a large quantity of data in the same place and have it digitized. Once you could do that, once you moved past the punch cards, if anybody remembers the punch card days, you had to sequentially put that data in. It made processing the data very expensive. As the processing speed picked up, as the technology started to evolve to store that data in large quantities, you started seeing big advances in terms of using that data. This is 1956. If you take a step past there and you look at the early 60s, we start looking at where it becomes more and more common to have data and to think about it. And so you start to have some actual numbers to look at. So we're talking about data. Let's get some data. The evolution of the value of data is an almost perfect correlation between cost of that data falling on a logistic level and the value of it increasing on an exponential level. As data got cheaper to put in the same place and to store and to analyze together, the value of that data began to accelerate. The key point was here, 1990. That's where the curve starts to average out. That's where you get the first ERP systems, which is generally when you move past purely financial data and started thinking about forecast and planning. That would have been a big step. That's when you get the first PC workstations that people are using in their jobs. So now they're actually able to manipulate data themselves for particular tasks they're doing. You've got the early internet, which if data is valuable because it's able to be combined with other data, the internet was a godsend for that, right? You really start to see that there. And at this point, data costs almost nothing to store. So we'll get to this in another slide, but we're getting to the point that asking yourself a question of should I store something, where should I store it, that's no longer a question anymore. Storage is so cheap, just assume that you need to keep it and then move forward from there. A little bit about economics. You can think of data as an asset. You can also think about it in the terms of a commodity. I like to talk of it in terms of oil, right? It has certain similarities to oil. You use it to drive a particular process. You have to consciously create it in some way. And we're not pumping it out of the ground. Obviously, we're just sort of capturing it as it happens. But you have to make a conscious choice to value it. And it has value along the same axes that commodities like oil do. It's utility, right? It's really useful. The more you can do with data, the better shape it's in, the fresher it is, the purer it is, the more of it's together in one place. And the nature of that data as having sort of a network effect, whereas you combine more and more data together, the whole becomes more and more value. Data is scarce. It's not scarce in the same way as oil, because oil just has a fixed amount. But data is scarce in that you have to capture it, right? You have to consciously choose to do it. And if you don't, then you didn't. And so it's scarce in whether or not you were able to capture or not. The third thing is marketability. How valuable is your data in terms of other people paying for it? Are there established buyers in your industry for particular types of data? Are there marketplaces that are already set up to process that? If you're doing any kind of data that has potential value in the hedge fund industry, in the financial services industry, there are marketplaces that are set up purely to take that data from you and sell it to financial services companies. So the more you can fit into some existing supply chain marketability aspect of it, the more valuable your data is going to be right out of the gate. The other thing to know about data is that if you don't use it, it doesn't have value. And the more you use it, the more value it has in a never-ending cycle, right? When you start thinking about how to use data in a company, you typically start from very basic, identify the sources, get insights, find some results, and then figure out where to go next, right? As you go around that cycle, every time you circle it, the data gets a little more and more valuable because more people are exposed to what you did with it, more people see the results of it, more people come to you wanting you to apply the data in different ways, more people come to you wanting more data. The more and more you go around that cycle, the more benefit you'll see from it. And it doesn't happen right away. You need to be the one, and when I say you, I'm typically talking about the role that I have, but I'm using you as a proxy for me in terms of putting yourself in that mindset. You need to lead with the vision of what to do with the data. Don't expect people to come to you and ask, right? They don't know what the data can do. They don't know what data they have. That was typically why roles like mine exist, is because there was that gap of knowledge. You need to translate the business challenges, the business opportunities into what that data can do and bring that to the surface. And you'll start to get that cooperative relationship that really leads to results. And the last thing to keep in mind is that the point that we're in with data as an asset is you can't not do it anymore. There was a long time where you could just sort of say, well, we haven't started to look at the data yet, or we haven't built a data warehouse yet, or we haven't built something big enough. That time's passed. Companies exist that are valued entirely on their data. If you look at Google, Facebook, right? Google's it's not that they're super amazing at selling ads, it's because the ads are super targeted. And that's from the data they have. Primarily value on the data. Customers are going to expect the same thing. If any of you have ever been in a sales support or a pure sales role, outside sales role, customers, if they say, well, can you tell me this from your data, and you say, no, we haven't looked at it like that, you look bad, right? They expect you to be able to help them and translate the data. If you just say, well, I'm going to give you a report, you're giving them data, but you're not showing your mastery of that data, right? That requires you to be the one to interpret and to surface those insights and come up. So you can't just sit back and report out to customers anymore. They want more than that. And the last thing, if you work for a company or you sell to companies that are publicly traded, your CEO may have sat on a conference call, and that earnings call, the analyst might have said, tell me how you're monetizing the data that you have. A lot of positions like mine got created because the CEO was on a call and somebody asked that question and he didn't have any idea what to do, so they said we need to hire somebody to monetize our data. That's an opportunity. It's one that investors know, and it's one that more and more public companies, at least, are definitely focused on, is maximizing the value of every asset, including the data. Let's talk about making better data. Right? Anybody who's in an engineering role or is developing software is creating data. You think of it as putting little oil wells in different parts of the company and kind of sucking the data out through the various processes. The bid edict, and take this and repeat it, print it out, you don't even have to attribute it to me. All data that is not gathered is lost. If you don't collect it, you don't have it, and it never existed. You have to do that from the very beginning of every step you take where you're going to need the data. You have to capture it up front. I don't know how many of you are familiar with IT, moving through big IT projects, but there's a tendency when you have a requirement around data that they'll say, oh, we're going to do that in phase 2. Now, exercise to you as to how often you get to phase 2, but even if you do, you didn't get any data from before, right? It's not like functionality where software was worth $1,000 and then you add a little functionality and now it's worth $1,100, right? You no longer can capture the data that comes before then. There are some instances in companies that have been around a long time where I would even say don't bother collecting the data, because the amount that you'll actually have with that element compared to the amount that you have without it will make it largely useless, right? So you have to have that mindset right from the beginning about capturing that data. Never accept this, we don't have space to store it. That is no longer true. There are plenty of strategies to deal with even data at the Facebook, the Google scale, plenty of strategies to deal with it. You can sample it, you can move it through stages, you can pipe it to software that's capable of handling that, AWS, Microsoft, anything like that is going to have stuff to help you handle these large volumes of data. You can rotate it through. Don't leave data on the table. If it's possible that it could be used, at least give somebody in the company a chance to make use of it before you just delete it. No one has ever said, I wish we didn't collect that, right? That'll never be stated. They'll always say, I wish we had thought about that at the time, or I wish we had saved that instead of letting it evaporate into the ephemerity of memory loss, right? Listen to Drake. Forget data warehouses. There was a time when a data warehouse was the appropriate approach for taking a wide variety of data in all sorts of different sources, putting it in the same place, letting people query it. The problem with data warehouses is that they were a database approach to a data problem, right? Data warehouses require structure. They require you to make lots of choices about how you model things, what level you collect it at, what data types you're going to use, what's valuable. If you're If you're saving data primarily for the purposes of querying it, you're thinking about what's the optimum index types, all sorts of little decisions that, that make a data warehouse work. But what they do is they hurt the data. Because the data as you gather it, when it comes out of the source system, when it's in its purest form at the very beginning, that is as good as it will ever get. That's the point you want to capture it, right? All you can do from that point forward is degrade it or lose it. So think of that very first creation of the data as the point at which you say, here, we need to save it like this. Use strings. If you're not saving data types, if you're not going to do math with a thing, leave it as a string. Numbers, IDs, binary, right? String it, dump it in a data lake, and worry about it later. There's no point in getting in the way of this process to save space or to establish structure. Deal with that later. The last thing I'll put, which is sort of a one that a lot of companies have, is they'll try to permission data based on use cases. So you'll have your company say, anybody can get access to any data we want as long as you have a demonstrated use case and the management agrees that what you're trying to do with the data is useful for what you're trying to query it for. There are lots of different ways of saying that, right? That's a problem, because if you don't know what the data is, you don't know what you can do with it. And if you don't know what you can do with it, you can't ask for a use case. You can't write it. You're stuck. It's much better to decide what types of roles should have access to what data, and then just give it to them. Don't force people to request database by database. When I write queries in my company, I have to get table level permission. There is no reason that I should have to request a table by table. If my role is a chief data scientist, it should be database, all of it, right? That's the approach that you should be taking. That's what maximizes that value. Siloed development is inevitable. It is almost impossible for any company to truly say that every decision they make about data takes into account all of the various use cases that that data has in their company, right? You have to start with the assumption that that's going to happen and really start to think about ways to mitigate it. Finding out from other people what they're going to do is a big part of that. Understanding the various parts of the business, understanding the downstream use cases, understanding how that information is going to be joined together. You got two sets of data, two sets of two data. One of them has an index that you can be joined and the other one doesn't. One of them is exponentially more valuable than the other, right? But you had to have looked ahead of time to know what kind of nomenclatures, conventions, what kind of formats other people are using, how are they defining their regions, how are they defining different types of customers, and bringing that into something we're building. Here's a use case. You got a website, right? I'm going to use my industry. I should say that from the beginning. I work for an outplacement services company, so when you get laid off from a very large firm, they typically have career services as part of your separation package. So I studied the job search process and lots of tools and things that sort of help that along. We track applications that come in through the website from candidates of ours, right? We have tools, web-based tools where they can sort of apply for jobs. It's entirely possible that the resume database that we have only keeps the date that the resume was submitted, because people that designed the resume database said, why do you need another time? That's crazy, it doesn't matter, the date's fine, they just keep it as a date. Well, when you go to the website guy and you say, well, we got dates, but we don't have timestamps, he's going to say, well, if I knew the time, I could tell you whether they came to the website before or after they submitted the application, because that's a completely different use case. If they applied and then came to the website, that implies that they found out about it somewhere else, which means we need to go through to find out where it's somewhere else. If they applied after, then they probably found it through us. But because the people that designed the resume database didn't think about what the website front end was going to do with it, they just thought, let's save a little space, we'll use a date instead of a timestamp, and you found yourself long after the fact trying to deal with that fact. Come along. This is the last thing. If you don't try to coordinate this in some way, the fact that your data is more valuable when it's together will just be by chance, right? You'll just happen to have chosen the same set of index, the same numerical descriptor, the same pattern of storing that information, right? If you don't do it intentionally, and the ability of companies to leverage all of this data together, and again, continuing to add value by making it meaningful together, is what's going to determine the future of many, 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 many companies. And if you don't do it intentionally, it's just coincidence whether you end up being able to capture that value. So don't run that risk. The other thing that makes data valuable is when you can integrate it with external data. So in my world, the government agency here, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they have a standard occupation system where they kind of list job titles out. When we went to implement a resume database and we wanted to have a list of job titles that people could use, we used the SOC codes from the government agency. Why? Why didn't we apply a bunch of fancy data science and create our own, job taxonomy? That was what, the executives come there, their big ideas about big data. We'll create our own job taxonomy. It'll be super useful. Well, you know what it won't be useful for is anything from the BLS, which means by choosing that, we were able to combine our data with the data from the BLS and create something that was more valuable than both of those things in isolation, which is where it would have been. You can buy it from other people. You can buy it from companies that specialize in analytics. There's a company called Wanted Analytics in my industry that sells labor market intelligence data. Again, SOC codes are what makes that possible. You can also crawl it yourself. Is it sitting out on the web somewhere? Don't sit back and wait for an API. Don't file a request for IT to build it. Don't pay somebody. Just get your Python out, get your beautiful soup out, crank that thing out, and scrape it, and get that data in, and then start using it. Right? Take the initiative to just get it. If you can combine it with data you have, that's how you get the most value from that transaction. If you're just taking data from a government agency and spitting it back to a client, yeah, if they had never seen that data before, they might find it interesting, but you're not creating any competitive advantage out of that, right? It's only by combining it with your own data that has a lot of value. So, data driving revenue. The biggest thing that a lot of companies have right now is this idea that they're not perceived as being digital enough, or they're not perceived as being as capable with data as they should be by customers, clients, investors, etc. The issue with that is that the skills that you need to be better with data aren't typically skills that your average, even rock star sales professional are going to have. It's not their training, right? They're trained to do messaging, to talk about product, to match needs with demand. It's just the data side of things doesn't come into it. So using that data to bring that to a salesperson and say, here's something you can show, here's something that will inform you, you will be providing them value even though you don't think of yourself as being in sales, right? Let's look at an example of that. So microsites. This has been around probably for a while, so most of y'all are familiar with this, so it's a nice way to talk about it. But I want to talk about it specifically in the context of driving revenue, right? Marketing and engineering. Little web-based tools, visualizations that you put up on the web that people come and see, and it makes your company look like they know what they're talking about when you talk about data. It's even better if you can fit it into some sort of marketing plan, messaging that's going off now. You may not be exposed to that depending on where you are in the company, but generally if you call up somebody in marketing or sales and you say, hey, we're working on some ways of visualizing data in interesting ways, we'd love to align that behind whatever you're going to be messaging a quarter from now, they're going to tell you. Or you can just look at whatever is in the press now. A lot of times, marketing messaging changes rather slowly. So if you've just started a new push, you may have your answer right there. This is an example of something that I did. This is just a very simple model that combined the BLS statistics and our internal statistics to try to develop a sense of how long it will take for someone to land a job in a particular industry, geography, and with two characterizations. The reason we did this was because the product we sell is a time-bound consulting program. So the time is the primary driver of revenue for us, which means if I can go to a client who wants to buy a 4-month program and tell them that, hey, this person's going to take 6 months, and they take 6 months, I have turned data into revenue. When we put this out there, it was purely for the sales organization to show in sales meetings, right? They sit with their laptops, they open it up. What we did with it afterward was we ran every single one of our clients through this tool, and we said, what programs are they selling now? What programs do we think they should be selling? And where are the gaps? Where should the program be longer than what they currently have? That's an upsell opportunity, right? And it's a data-based upsell opportunity. It's not just the salesperson showing up like they do every time and want more money. It's them showing up and saying, you're not delivering enough time. You have to be careful. One, it's important here that you choose the factors that you can actually do that type of work on, right? If I had just randomly picked some characterizations here and randomly picked these things, it wouldn't have been as effective when I went back to our internal systems to try to do that type of math. Excuse me, that type of math. The other thing to keep in mind is that we didn't show this directly to clients. And the reason was that it's entirely possible that somebody will have a 7-month program and the client might look and see it says 6 months. Now, the client might say, well, I want to reduce the length of the program. So now data is driving negative revenue. So we don't want that. It's not disingenuous because anything you do with data and models is describing an average, which means even if this says 6 months, there are a ton of people that take 9, 10, 12 months. So it's not like we're saying everybody's done in 6 months. But if you don't control how something like this is consumed, you will be at the mercy of the pre-existing perceptions of whoever you're showing it to. And in our business, that's procurement. And you never want to go up against procurement if they have more data than you do. The other place you can look is in client support. This is outside sales, inside sales. If any of you ever tried to help out an account services team, anything you can do, interesting, creative visualizations to show them what's happening, anything you can do here to bring that to fore is going to make them look better, right? How does that generate to revenue? Every company, every big company, or if you're a customer to a big company, will periodically go through a rebid, and that's where even though you won the business, even though you've been their person for 3 years or 4 years, they'll still put out this whole process to try to see whether your price is still good. When you approach this as, hey, look how cool we are proactively, you can start to shortcut that process, right? We've had clients who were trying to go to bid and asked us to respond to an RFP, and we talked about, the next slide I'm going to show you, and they just said, all right, well, I guess we won't do an RFP. You guys are fine, right? Because they didn't go to RFP, we didn't have to drop our prices, which means we stayed at the same level, which means data brought us revenue, or saved us from losing revenue, which in math is the same thing, right? You save from losing it. The one thing to keep in mind is account teams specifically, if we're talking about inside sales, client support teams, they're very protective. They want to own the client relationship. And so if you, regardless of your role, if you're not on the account team and you come into that relationship and try to bring in material, messaging, potential points of disconnect, they will get very nervous about that. So don't just assume that that's going to be the case, right? Bring them something that's simple enough for them to understand, but also leaves some room for interpretation so that they can take that messaging and customize that for whatever client they're dealing with at the time. If you just give them the answer and you call it a day, they'll look at the answer and they'll say, well, it either matches what I'm talking to the client about next week or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it goes in the trash bin. It doesn't matter how good it is. If it doesn't match the messaging, they won't read it. But if you give them something they can interpret, well, now you're giving them messaging that works in any circumstance. Let's look at 2 examples of that. Again, this is mocked up data, but this is work we've actually done. This is a customer activity timeline. Each one of these horizontal lines is a single customer. The dots are particular activities that they've engaged in, color-coded. So we put this visualization together because it's sort of a God's eye view of what candidates go through, right? And when they saw that, honestly, this is the slide that got the RFP process canceled because they'd never seen the visualization like this of just everything that was going on. I sat in a call and you could almost hear them going, well, you know, this guy only has 2 of this meeting and this guy has a bunch, and so he's clearly doing a lot. Like they're like acting out the process of us as a business, and that is an entirely different conversation they are having in a sales environment. The big value we added here was a prediction score. So we took those activities and we said, what can we understand about taking these activities and associate that with an outcome? If we can measure the likelihood of that particular pattern resulting in it, then we can highlight people who are doing poorly, people who are doing well, this guy with a 90 up there, and it lets the account team talk about how they're proactively addressing customer concerns because they have this visibility that another company wouldn't have had, that would have had to wait for the program to finish before they realized the guy didn't get a job. We know right away whether the guy's on track to get a job, even if he still has 6 months left of the process. That's a big differentiator. And this look, even though it's specific to, I've explained it as specific to my industry, you can probably apply this in a lot of different contexts, right? Understand customer activity, tie it to an outcome, bring that information to an account team, and let them seem like they know way more about that data than anybody else does. Here's another example that'll work in just about any context. This is called a utilization matrix. On the horizontal is the number of customers, or in our case it's candidates, so I'll go back and forth with the language. The number of candidates who have utilized a particular activity of some kind. These are sort of activities that they can do. And the vertical axis is the number of times that they utilized it, if they utilized it at least once, right? And so it's two kind of spectrums. One is, did they use it at all? And then if they did use it, how popular was it? If you show this, if you just made a list of the most popular activities and gave it to an account team, it's not going to help them. If you just made a list of the most effective activities and gave it to an account team, it's not going to help them. But if you show this to an account team and they know that they're looking for an opportunity to show how they're driving engagement, they can look up here and they can say, well, we've got these applications here. It's not very well utilized, but when it is utilized, it's very effective. What does that mean? That means we need to drive discovery. Right? That means that an account team person can stand in front of a client and they can say, here's what we're going to do over the next quarter. We found that applications, virtual applications, are very effective, and we're going to drive use by focusing on discovery, because discovery is the issue if it's high. If you've got something down here, highly utilized but low absolute utilization, that implies that you need to increase the value of that activity. Right? People aren't finding much use for it, even though they are actually experiencing it. The other level that we added to this, which is the red ones, going back to the previous slide where we talked about predicting, building those predictive models also puts you in the context of being able to identify which activities are the most effective versus others. And so highlighting those gives people an easy way to prioritize if there are many opportunities to do this. Right? If they were going to focus on something purely from a mathematical standpoint, it would be something down here, right? Phone-based consultant meetings, because it's shown to be effective, but it has moderate usage and moderate utilization. So having this conversation, and again, we're not showing this to a client, right? You're not gonna put it in front of them, because then you don't control the message. Then you don't control the interpretation. But if you give it to the account team and you let them match whatever it is they're talking about with the learnings from that slide, they look good and you look good because you're the one that gave it to them. Another thing you do is present at conferences. So I'm not talking about here because I'm not actually presenting the data, but you can take data that you use in your company and show it to conferences. The most effective ones are when you have an industry conference that's attended by practitioners, but the speakers are typically vendors. Those are the kind of conferences you want to get to, because your ability to use your data to show a unique, compelling perspective on something, a challenge that your industry has, will elevate you in the minds of those people who are attending that conference. You can do studies, surveys, combine that with your data. Again, a lot of companies will just say, I'm going to do a survey, right? And the marketing company goes off and hires a survey company, and they do a survey, and then they create like a 30-page PDF with all the survey results, and they give that out, right? Or you can do the survey in a way that the data you're collecting overlaps with the data you have, index those together. Now you have a survey that you can't just repeat, right? Another company in your industry can't just run the same survey and bring the same results because they don't have your data. So being able to do it in a way that combines it with that data and then talking about it in a conference environment is a great way to do that, because you don't have to worry about somebody stealing the idea because they don't have the data, right? They can't just reproduce it. The other thing you could do, if you're not comfortable sharing your data, if you're in an industry that's particularly concerned about that, you can look at just abstracting and sharing the methods that you use to analyze data, the process, right? Being able to show the process, being able to show the tools that you're using, being able to show some of the outcomes that you're seeing from that, even if you're not being so specific that you're really telling them what's happening, at least you're giving them a sense that that's what's going on. The better you look in the eyes of the people you're talking to, and the more conversations you're going to have afterward about how amazing your company is at presenting data and at understanding the data that they go through. How many people have had the idea that we need to be more predictive? That was the big thing when I started my company. We need to be more predictive. Not everybody really understands what that means, right? Because they just think it's sort of a natural step. if you're used to counting something, if you're used to dealing with something in a time series, and somebody comes along and say, let's be more sophisticated, you're like, natural is, well, let's just use it to look forward and predict, right? So you're going to get a lot of requests for that. So how do you know what to predict? Well, you can look at any time series and forecast it out. That's what you see there. That's an example of some demand forecasting that we did. Any time series can be forecasted. Anything you can do that compares customers or users to other people like them and surface the differences, the things that drove outcomes. If you look before at the chart we used with that prediction score, that was based on that concept, right? You're comparing them with others like them and showing what's effective. Those suggestions become extremely valuable. Use what you know about the data to set thresholds and let your customers know there's a problem before they know there's a problem. Nothing is worse than having a broken system or an issue and you don't know what it is because it's not triggering big errors, it's just the data doesn't look right, right? That's the hardest thing to do, is just when everything seems to be working correctly but the data just doesn't look right. Using some of these predictive things can actually give you the ability to raise those alerts. Any data presented to a customer has the potential to say, what's that going to look like in the future? Any number, any chart, any feature, anything, you can look forward to that and give them an idea of what to expect if they don't do anything differently than what they're doing today, which is what the forecast is based on. It's always based on if we continue doing what we're doing, what's going to happen. And the last thing that I'll say about prediction is the first bullet. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't even really have to be good. It just has to be better than a naive approach. A naive approach is like, let's average the revenue from the last 4 quarters and that'll give us the quarter for January, right? That's like just a very simple, not complicated at all, right? Whatever model you're using now, consider that to be the naive approach and see if you can predict it better than that. And when I say predict it better than that, I'll be more specific because we're dealing with people that know what we're talking about. I'm not talking about fit, I'm talking about predictive power. As an industry, we move past the idea of a model fit. It's all about how good that model is at predicting what's going to happen. So if you can have more predictive power from a model than whatever they're using now, you've improved it. And to the extent that that ties to revenue, depending on what type of company you have turned that data into revenue, even if the model's not a good fit, even if it doesn't even seem to be that much an improvement, as long as it's better than the naive approach, you're doing really well. The last thing you do that we'll talk about is to monetize the data directly. Now, not every company is going to have the ability to do this, depending on what industry you're in and the way that that information is captured. But one thing you can do is to aggregate that into some kind of an industry observing index. So the example I'll use is ADP. Right? ADP publishes an employment index based on, they're a payroll company. They have a lot of information on payroll. So they anonymize that, aggregate it up, and they have the ADP payroll index. How much is that good for them in a sales context? I don't know, but just about anybody that's thinking about measuring employment knows about the ADP index. So when ADP shows up, at least there's that point of familiarity that they might not have had before if ADP hadn't taken the step to do that. You can sell access to your data directly. Now again, this is even one that's more rare, but there are companies set up that literally just gather data and then sell access to it. It's super common in my industry because everybody wants to do contact management and things where, oh, let's get a bunch of LinkedIn profiles and we'll let you search and match them and you can return the profiles and things. It's not common in every industry, but if your data is something that you can actually just sell by giving access to it, that's a great way to monetize it. In fact, that's the easiest way to monetize it because you're not doing anything with it, right? You're just putting it in a form that it can be accessed and then charging some of that money to get access to it. The last thing that I'll talk about is consulting services. So our company is just starting to do this now. Again, your mileage may vary, but the idea that you can sell value-added services that provide more value to your customer than specifically what they've hired you to do. If the delivery of those consulting services is primarily enabled by the data that you have, then this can drive revenue because you can say, we have a product that we're selling you. Now let's talk about the service we can sell you. Based on the data that we've aggregated from all of our clients together, we're going to give you access to that data, even if the data is not specifically about you, right? Providing people context. I'll give you an example. if you were in my industry and we were doing time to land, that's the big one for us. It's time to land, right? If I could publish time to land data and just show it to them, that would be within the scope of the normal delivery of our services, right? Your company, you send us people, we get them jobs, and they would record how many of the jobs that we get. If we show that in context, and we actually try to sell you a consulting arrangement as to how you can best position people as they leave your company to have the most service on the job market, that's a service you can charge for that's more than what they're paying now. And that's data directly bringing in revenue, directly creating new lines of business within that. Last thing I want to talk about is GDPR, because a lot of data people are very scared of GDPR. It was sort of seen as a, everybody know what GDPR is? Anybody? Yeah. This was sort of like treated with fear, because the idea was, well, now we can't, if this spreads, right, we won't be able to use the data to do stuff, and that puts people like me out of a job. I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice, so take what I'm saying with the lens that you would need to ask your lawyer, but it doesn't terrify me as much as it terrifies a lot of people. A lot of maybe you in the audience are typically thinking about tech companies, advertising-driven social networks, those things. It's a big deal in those worlds, but most people don't work for those companies. So outside of a sales context, in terms of like leads and things like that, outside of that context, most businesses don't actually find a lot of value in knowing what somebody's name is, right? I don't care what the candidate's name is when I'm looking at him, right? I'm more interested in his background and his behavior. The use case that you're trying to control for, which is what these things were designed to go after, was using personal information about people to target them in ways that they weren't expecting. So if you stay out of that realm and you just stay with dealing with anonymized data in aggregate, you're going to be fine. A couple of things to try. There's something called lossy bootstrap, which is where you assume that data is missing from a particular database. You describe the data that's missing based on an A/B test, or that's the wrong word for it, but a before and after comparison of the mixes, and then you resample to control for the fact that you lost that data. The problem that GDPR is going to have is it allows individuals to remove their data from your database, which means it'll be essentially random, right? You'll just randomly lose data from out of your databases. So one way to deal with that is to account for it by resampling. The other thing you do is be very liberal with hashing. Anything that's a name or something like that, and you're just like, depending on which system it's going into, hash it, don't keep it. There's just, yeah, you need to be able to know what it was so you can link it together to something else, but just hash it and don't worry about it. As long as you're not put in a situation where they can take that hash and rejoin it to recreate all of that stuff, then you've avoided what GDPR was concerned about, which is the ability to back into that personal data even though you've hashed it, right? You have to hash it and then one-way hash it, essentially, without the ability to recreate it. The other thing you do is aggregate over time. So let's say your GDPR person decided that we're going to dump out all data older than 5 years, right? We're just going to remove it because we don't want to have it around. Before they do that, aggregate it, but keep the descriptors about what was underneath it. Keep the mixes. Keep the percent of customers from different parts of the business. That sort of descriptive stuff, while it's not going to let you reproduce the underlying data, because that's what they're trying to avoid, right? It will allow you to at least control for what it probably looked like if you go back in the future to try to do some of that analysis and create some of those tools that we've been talking about. So I hope this has been helpful. I'm happy to take questions, or if you guys have any comments or anything like that. I know this has been mostly me talking, so I want to make sure that we have time to go out. So thank you. This is my whole job, so this is basically just like 2 years of this. Yeah?
How do you start understanding the actual dollar value of this data? And how do you start figuring that stuff out if you haven't been doing this traditionally?
If you're not monetizing it directly, then you're going to go with the opinions of other people in the organization. I mean, especially sales messaging stuff. It's hard to know whether something you're going to build is actually going to make a difference. The only thing you can do is embrace MVPs, right? Get an early version of it out and into an account management team's hands so they can see whether it makes a difference or not before you build in a giant process to produce it. But other than that, you really just, it's your vision of saying, here's what I think we can do with the data. Let's see if we can actually make some money at it. Yeah. Yep.
Regarding GDP or whatever the name of the law is, let's say that we have thrown a whole bunch of data in that data lake. It's going to cost us a whole lot of money to be able to go and extract the data and remove individual accounts, or should we start thinking about masking or hashing data as we're throwing it into the lake going forward?
Yeah, so the partitioning process is going to go a long way to help address that. So the one thing that is not super common is people think of data lake as a single source of information for those things. It doesn't have to be. You can have a data lake that's only available to very permissioned GDPR people, and then as data is coming into that, you branch it, you do the hashing, you handle the ETL there. So when people who are like us, analysts, just general people that want to work with the data, it's already in a form where you're not breaking any laws by giving people access to it. That would be my advice. The other thing you can do if you're using tools to access it is they'll apply the permissioning in the tool that accesses it, so it automatically hashes or automatically masks something out or something like that. Better, I think, to do it on the way in so that you don't have to make a decision for someone as to how they're going to access it. But you can always apply that after the fact if you already have a bunch in there, and it would be a lot to move around. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry to obsess on the GDPR thing.
No.
One of the tenets of the GDPR is that ahead of time you have to inform users about specifically what their data is going to be, what's going to be done with their data. But if I'm going to aggregate it and resell it, how do you make that transition to your data is going to be munged and crunched and used for something, even if it's just aggregated, what am I looking for? Demographic information.
Yeah.
How do you bridge the gap between telling them what their data is going to be used for and, well, I might be selling it someday?
Yes. This is a good way to repeat again. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. But in general, the concern, again, the law is written in a way that's relatively prescriptive about what they're going to expect you to do. But in an industry standpoint, the approach seems to be that like they're trying to get you to not use people's data against them, right? And so not to say, I'm gonna make this list and then I'm just gonna sell it without your permission, and other people are then gonna know who you are, right? If you stay at the level where you have in your terms of service or something like, we aggregate data across broad spectrums and sell it as data services product, that's not going to trigger the same kind of thing as we're going to build you a credit record and then sell your credit record to your credit card company or your health insurance company or something like that. If you're not doing that, you'll have way less of this sort of nuanced, can I do that, can I not do that stuff. So my advice is always just to assume that you're in a context where you can't, and only violate it if you really have to. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. You can't list, I mean, the data like by its nature, right? I don't know what I'm going to do with it 10 years from now. The question is what I'm going to do with it foreseeable at the time? And it would be in violation of anything I specifically said I wasn't going to do with it. If you're working in that realm of legal uncertainty, that tends to be the approach that I've heard data practitioners take, is you look at the spirit of what they're trying to do and just stay far away from that, and you'll probably be okay. Yeah?
So can we take a common one like weblogs, for example? We have years and years, billions of rows of weblogs.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we should consider doing with that, even though I'm not sure if we covered it with our privacy policies in the past, but is there anything we should consider doing to anonymize it and perhaps monetize it?
So web data can be a fantastic way of giving people the ability to use your services in more depth by surfacing areas of the website, areas of the product that they haven't done before. But the difference is surfacing it to them and not just using it as learning, right? And so you say, well, I've noticed that this person here uses this part, this type of person uses this, and so we're going to sort of like send them an email and point this part to them, versus building it into the system so that as it's watching you move through, it's comparing you against other people in the past that have followed the same path, and then it starts to just anticipate where you're going to go and push you in that direction. That can be the kind of thing that really changes the way people interact with software, and you know, if your business is creating software, that can be a real substantive difference in the experience between those things. Weblogs are all about activity, so any of this stuff that talks about both of those charts before that I showed about activity would be useful in terms of that context as well. If you're trying to sell your software to sort of big companies, your account teams will want to talk about which parts of the service that people are using more than others, which parts we're going to encourage them to use, how we're going to drive additional usage. So that stuff can be a great play into that too. Anything with activity data, you can take those two slides as just verbatim and swap out your activities from mine and realize that kind of benefit. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, I put some cards in the back, so if anybody wants to pick them up or come talk to me afterward, happy to chat. But thanks for coming, and thanks for coming back from lunch and getting here on time. Appreciate it.